I'm enjoying my coffee when suddenly my daughter-in-law calls, sobbing about a blocked credit card. 5 minutes later, my son bursts through the door, ready for a showdown. But when he sees who's sitting next to me, his face goes white as a sheet. What happened next left us all speechless, and you'll never guess the twist at the end. Don't even think about skipping, because this story just keeps getting wilder. There are some days when you just want to melt into your favorite chair, slippers on, a hot cup of coffee in hand, and the comforting glow of The Golden Girls on the TV. That was my plan for the afternoon. A little slice of peace in a world that seems to get louder and more complicated with every passing year. I'd just settled in, the recliner creaking in that familiar way, when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw Rachel's name pop up. Now, let me tell you, when Rachel calls, it's rarely for a casual chat. My daughter-in-law is what you might call high-strung. She's the kind of woman who thinks a broken nail is a 5-alarm fire and a misplaced earring is grounds for a search party. So, I braced myself, took a deep breath, and answered. The moment I said hello, I was greeted by a sound that could only be described as a cross between a wail and a hiccup. "Honey, I stole your selfish mom's card and it was blocked. I was humiliated in front of the whole store," she sobbed, her words tumbling out in a rush. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. My card? Selfish? And why on earth was she using it in the first place? My mind raced, trying to piece together what on earth could have happened. I nearly dropped my coffee, the mug rattling against the side table as I tried to process her words. "Rachel, slow down," I said, but she was already off to the races. She launched into a tirade about how I'd ruined her day and embarrassed her in front of the entire checkout line. Apparently, she'd tried to use my credit card at the store, without asking, mind you, and the card had been declined. Not just declined, but blocked. The cashier, she claimed, had looked at her like she was a criminal, and the people in line behind her had started whispering. She painted a picture of herself, standing there, red-faced and mortified, while the world watched her shame. Now, I'll admit, a part of me felt a twinge of sympathy. No one likes to be embarrassed in public, especially not in a store where everyone seems to know everyone else's business. But another part of me, the part that's been around the block a few times, couldn't help but wonder why she thought it was okay to use my card in the first place. And to call me selfish? That was a new one. I've been called a lot of things in my life, stubborn, opinionated, even a little too honest for my own good. But selfish? That stung. As Rachel continued her rant, I tried to get a word in edgewise. "Rachel, why were you using my card?" I asked, but she barreled right past the question, too caught up in her own drama to hear me. She went on about how she'd planned to buy a new dress for some event, something about a work party, I think, and how she'd assumed it would be no big deal to use my card just this once. She said she'd meant to pay me back, but now, thanks to me, she was the laughingstock of the store. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a mix of anger and fear bubbling up inside me. What if my son David believed her version of events? What if he thought I'd set her up, or worse, that I was being petty and vindictive? The last thing I wanted was to be the villain in my own family, especially over something as silly as a credit card. But Rachel's voice, shrill and insistent, made it clear she was determined to cast herself as the victim and me as the bad guy. "Rachel, I didn't block the card to embarrass you," I tried to explain, but she cut me off again, her voice rising in pitch. Well, it sure felt like it. "I mean, who does that? Who blocks their own card without telling anyone? You could have warned me," she cried, as if it was perfectly normal for her to have access to my finances. I wanted to laugh, but the situation was too tense. Instead, I found myself wondering how we'd gotten here. When did boundaries become so blurry? When did it become acceptable for someone to take what wasn't theirs and then blame the owner for the consequences? I thought about all the times I'd tried to be generous, to welcome Rachel into the family, to make her feel at home. Had I been too accommodating? Had I made it too easy for her to take advantage? As the conversation dragged on, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. I could hear the TV in the background, the laughter of Dorothy and Blanche, a distant echo to the chaos unfolding in my living room. I glanced at the clock, wondering how long it would be before David called, or worse, showed up at my door demanding answers. The fear of a full-blown family feud loomed large, the kind you see on those reality shows where everyone's yelling and no one's listening. Finally, Rachel's sobs began to subside, replaced by a cold, accusatory silence. "I just hope you're happy," she said, her voice trembling. "You've really made things difficult for me." And with that, she hung up, leaving me staring at the phone. My coffee now cold, my afternoon peace shattered. I sat there for a moment, the weight of her words settling over me. Was I really the villain here? Or was this just another one of Rachel's melodramatic episodes? Either way, I had a feeling this was only the beginning. And as much as I wanted to crawl back into my recliner and pretend none of it had happened, I knew I'd have to face the fallout, whatever form it might take. I barely had time to process Rachel's dramatic phone call before the next act of this family circus began. I was still sitting in my recliner, the phone heavy in my hand, when I heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching in the driveway. Moments later, the front door flew open with a bang that nearly knocked my favorite wreath off its hook. In stormed my son, David, looking every bit like a man on a mission. His hair was wild, his shirt half-tucked, and his face was flushed with a mix of panic and frustration. If I didn't know better, I'd have thought he was auditioning for a superhero movie, except instead of a cape, he was armed with righteous indignation and a cell phone clutched in his fist. "Mom, explain this now!" he barked, barely pausing to catch his breath. His eyes darted around the room, searching for evidence of whatever crime Rachel had convinced him I'd committed. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the way they used to when he was a little boy and thought I'd hidden his Halloween candy. Only now, the stakes were higher and the accusations more serious. "Now let me ask you, when was the last time your grown child ran home because of a credit card crisis?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Here was my 40-year-old son, a grown man with a mortgage and a receding hairline, bursting into my living room like a teenager who'd just been grounded. But the look on his face told me this was no time for jokes. He was angry, confused, and, if I'm being honest, a little scared. And I knew exactly who had put that look there. Before I could even open my mouth, David started in. "Rachel just called me sobbing. She said you blocked your card on purpose to embarrass her. She said you called her selfish and made a scene at the store. Mom, what is going on?" His words tumbled out in a rush, each one sharper than the last. I could feel my own frustration rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was not the time to lose my temper, but just as David was about to launch into a full-blown lecture, one I'd heard 100 times before, about family unity and not making things harder than they need to be, he stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes, which had been blazing with anger, suddenly went wide. His jaw dropped, and for a moment he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Why? Because sitting next to me on the couch, cool as a cucumber, was none other than my old friend and his high school principal, Mrs. Thompson. She'd come over earlier that afternoon to help me set up my new online banking account. We'd been sipping tea and reminiscing about the good old days when David was still in braces and trying to sneak out of gym class. I'd almost forgotten she was there, so quiet and composed was her presence. "Mrs. Thompson?" David stammered, his voice suddenly small. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Thompson looked up from her tea, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Hello, David, it's been a while. I was just helping your mother with some banking issues. You know, technology can be a bit tricky for us old folks," she said, giving me a conspiratorial wink. I couldn't help but smile. Leave it to Mrs. Thompson to diffuse even the tensest situation with a bit of humor. David, however, was still trying to process the scene in front of him. I could see the confusion warring with the anger on his face. He glanced from me to Mrs. Thompson and back again, as if trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "Wait, so you weren't trying to embarrass Rachel?" he finally asked, his voice uncertain. I shook my head, feeling a mix of relief and exasperation. "No, David. I had no idea Rachel was planning to use my card. Mrs. Thompson and I were just updating my account information, and the bank suggested we block the card temporarily for security. Someone tried to use it at the mall this morning, and they flagged it as suspicious. I didn't even know it was Rachel until she called me, crying." Mrs. Thompson nodded in agreement. "It's true, David. Your mother was just following the bank's advice. These days, you can't be too careful with all the scams going around. I've seen more than a few parents in my day who've had their accounts compromised by someone they trusted." David's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He ran a hand through his hair. looking suddenly much older than his years. "I'm sorry, Mom, Rachel was so upset. She made it sound like you'd done it on purpose." I reached out and patted his hand. "I know, honey. But you have to understand, I would never do something like that to embarrass her, or you. I just wish she'd asked before using my card. That's all." For a moment, the three of us sat in silence, the tension slowly ebbing away. Mrs. Thompson took another sip of her tea, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You know, David, I remember a time when you tried to use your mother's library card to check out a stack of comic books. You were so sure you could get away with it, but the librarian caught you red-handed. Some lessons, it seems, take a little longer to stick," David chuckled, the sound breaking the last of the tension. "Yeah, I guess some things never change." As the laughter faded, I felt a wave of gratitude for Mrs. Thompson's presence. She'd always had a way of bringing perspective to even the messiest situations. And as I looked at my son, no longer the angry, confused man who'd stormed through my door, but the boy I'd raised, trying his best to do right by his family, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we'd all come out of this a little wiser. But as any mother knows, in a family like ours, the drama is never truly over. And I had a feeling this was just the beginning of another unforgettable chapter. You should have seen David's face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, standing there in the middle of my living room, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Mrs. Thompson, what are you doing here?" He finally managed to stammer, his voice a mix of disbelief and embarrassment. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. After all, it's not every day you walk into your mother's house expecting a showdown and instead find your old high school principal sitting on the couch, sipping tea as if she owned the place. Mrs. Thompson, bless her heart, just smiled that knowing smile of hers and took another dainty sip from her floral teacup. She had always been the picture of composure, whether she was breaking up a cafeteria food fight or, apparently, diffusing a family crisis. "I was just helping your mother set up her new online banking," she said, her voice calm and steady. "We had to block her card for security. Someone tried to use it at the mall this morning." She glanced at me with a twinkle in her eye, as if to say, "Don't worry, I've got this." David's face went through a whole range of emotions in the span of a few seconds. Shock, confusion, and then slowly realization. He looked at me, then at Mrs. Thompson, and then back at me again, as if the pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place. "Wait, Rachel tried to use Mom's card? Without asking?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't help but chuckle, the tension in the room finally starting to melt away. "Looks like someone's been caught red-handed," I said, raising an eyebrow. "And not by me, but by the bank's fraud department." I tried to keep my tone light, but there was no denying the relief I felt. For once, I wasn't the villain in this little family drama. David let out a long sigh and sank down onto the arm of the couch, rubbing his temples. "I can't believe this," he muttered. "Rachel made it sound like you'd set her up on purpose. She was so upset, Mom. She said everyone in the store was staring at her, and the cashier treated her like a criminal." He looked up at me, his eyes full of apology. "I'm sorry I jumped to conclusions. I should have known better." I reached over and patted his knee, the way I used to when he was a little boy and needed reassurance. "It's all right, honey. I know you were just trying to look out for your wife, but you have to admit this whole thing is a little ridiculous. I mean, who tries to use someone else's credit card without asking and then gets mad when it doesn't work out?" Mrs. Thompson set her teacup down and leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "David, I've seen a lot of things in my years as a principal, but one thing I've learned is that honesty always comes out in the end. It might take a little time, and there might be some hurt feelings along the way, but the truth has a way of making itself known." She gave him a gentle smile. "Your mother did nothing wrong. In fact, she did exactly what she was supposed to do, protect herself and her finances." David nodded, looking chastened. "You're right, I guess I let Rachel's emotions get the better of me. She can be pretty convincing when she wants to be." He managed a weak smile, and I could see the boy I'd raised peeking through the man he'd become. I decided it was time to lighten the mood. "Well, if it makes you feel any better, David, you're not the first person in this family to get caught with their hand in the cookie jar. Remember that time you tried to sneak out with my car keys when you were 16? You thought you were so clever, But you left your sneakers by the door. I heard you tiptoeing all the way down the hall. I laughed, and even Mrs. Thompson joined in, her laughter warm and genuine. David groaned, but the tension in his shoulders eased. I guess I never was very good at sneaking around, he admitted. Maybe that's why I married someone who's a little more resourceful. Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow. Resourceful is one word for it. But I think Rachel owes your mother an apology, and maybe a thank you too. Not everyone would have handled this as gracefully as she did. I smiled, feeling a sense of vindication. Well, I suppose I could have made a bigger fuss, but what good would that have done? At the end of the day, we're family. We have to look out for each other, even when we drive each other crazy. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. I'll talk to Rachel. She needs to understand that what she did wasn't okay. And I'll make sure she apologizes to you, Mom. You didn't deserve any of this. I squeezed his hand, grateful for the gesture. Thank you, David. That means a lot. And tell Rachel I'm not mad, just a little disappointed. I hope she learns from this. Mrs. Thompson stood up, brushing imaginary crumbs from her skirt. Well, I think my work here is done. You two have some talking to do, and I have a book club meeting to get to. But remember, the truth always comes out, sometimes with a little help from an old principal. She winked at David, who grinned sheepishly. As she left, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The storm had passed, and the truth had finally come out. Maybe things wouldn't be perfect, but at least we could move forward, with a little more honesty, and maybe a little more laughter, too. After the dust settled, the house felt lighter, as if a storm had passed and left behind a fresh, clean breeze. David and I sat together on the couch, the tension that had filled the room earlier now replaced by a sense of relief and, dare I say, a little amusement. Mrs. Thompson, ever the peacemaker, had just left, but not before regaling us with a few stories from David's high school days, tales of him sneaking snacks into class, trying to outsmart the lunch monitors, and once, memorably, attempting to convince the entire faculty that the fire alarm was just a science experiment gone wrong. David groaned and rolled his eyes, but I could see the corners of his mouth twitching with a reluctant smile. Even I had to admit, it was good to laugh again after all the drama. Rachel, meanwhile, was still sulking on the phone, her voice drifting in from the kitchen where she'd retreated to nurse her wounded pride. Every now and then, I'd catch a snippet of her conversation with her sister, something about unfair treatment and never shopping at that store again. I let her have her moment. We all need to lick our wounds sometimes, and I figured she'd come around eventually. After all, family squabbles are as old as time, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that a little space and a lot of patience can work wonders. David, for his part, was quick to apologize. He turned to me, his eyes earnest and a little sheepish. Mom, I'm really sorry for jumping to conclusions. I should have known better than to believe Rachel's version without hearing your side. I guess I just wanted to fix things for her, but I ended up making it worse. He squeezed my hand, and I could feel the sincerity in his grip. It's funny, isn't it? No matter how old our children get, they still need reassurance, still need to know that we love them, even when they mess up. I smiled and patted his knee. Oh, honey, if I got upset every time someone in this family jumped to conclusions, I'd have run out of steam years ago. Besides, it's not the first time, and it won't be the last. The important thing is that we talk it out and move on. That's what families do. I meant it too. Life is too short to hold grudges, especially over something as silly as a blocked credit card. We sat in companionable silence for a while, the kind that only comes after a good laugh and a little bit of truth-telling. I thought about all the times over the years when things had gone sideways. Birthday cakes dropped on the floor, Thanksgiving turkeys burned to a crisp, misunderstandings that turned into shouting matches and then, eventually, into inside jokes. It's funny how the moments that feel the most embarrassing or stressful at the time often become the stories we tell and retell, the ones that bring us closer together. Mrs. Thompson's stories had reminded me of that. She'd painted such a vivid picture of David as a mischievous teenager, always testing boundaries but never straying too far from home. I could see the pride in her eyes as she talked about the man he'd become, and I felt a swell of gratitude for the people who'd helped shape him along the way. It takes a village, as they say, and I was lucky to have had such good company on the journey. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, I found myself reflecting on the lessons hidden in the day's chaos. Family drama is inevitable. There's no getting around it. We all have our moments of selfishness, our lapses in judgment, our knee-jerk reactions. But if we can meet those moments with a little humor and a lot of love, they don't have to tear us apart. In fact, they can bring us closer together, reminding us of what really matters. And let's be honest, ladies, who among us hasn't had a little credit card confusion now and then? I remember the time I tried to use my husband's card at the grocery store, only to realize I'd grabbed my library card by mistake. The cashier and I had a good laugh, and I walked out with a bag of groceries and a reminder not to shop in a hurry. Life is full of these little mix-ups, and sometimes the best thing we can do is laugh at ourselves and move on. As the day wore on, Rachel finally emerged from the kitchen, her expression a mix of embarrassment and defiance. She mumbled an apology, not quite meeting my eyes, but I could tell she was trying. I pulled her into a hug, surprising us both. "It's all right, Rachel. Next time, just ask. We're family, and families help each other, but we also respect each other's boundaries." She nodded, and I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. Maybe it wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Later that evening, as I poured myself a second glass of wine and settled back into my recliner, I couldn't help but smile. The house was quiet again, the chaos of the day fading into memory. I thought about all the women out there who've weathered their own family storms, who've learned to find the humor in the madness and the love in the mess. We're stronger than we think, and a little laughter goes a long way. So, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have laughed, cried, or maybe poured yourself a second glass of wine? Whatever your answer, I hope you remember that you're not alone. We're all in this together, navigating the ups and downs of family life with as much grace and humor as we can muster. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the front lines of family life. Share your own credit card confusion moments in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Until next time, stay strong, stay sassy, and remember, laughter really is the best medicine.